Welcome back. You made it to Module 2. You're on your way to breaking free for good. Hopefully, you learned a bit in the first module and had a little fun too. At this point, you should have your debt inventory worksheet completed listing all of your debts. If you haven't, complete that first. We'll be using that worksheet today to make a plan for attacking each of the consumer debts on that list. With that out of the way, let's get started. I'm Peter, and I'm excited to continue our journey with you. Today, we're going to learn how to chip away at our consumer debt. Consumer debts include a wide variety of different types of loans and debts, and we can all be in a very different place with them too. So there's a lot to cover today. We won't be able to cover everything, but I think what we will cover will be extremely valuable. As I mentioned, the typical American household may have a variety of consumer debts from medical bills to personal loans. Credit cards are commonplace, as are auto loans and mortgages. And most households don't just have one or two, but many have multiple debts or even all of them. And that amount of financial obligation can quickly weigh us down. On top of that, consumer debts can be some of the toughest debts to shake because they are often interconnected. An unexpected medical bill might get charged to a credit card, which gets paid off with a personal loan, which might get rolled into a home equity loan, which might make us struggle to stay on top of that car payment. Sometimes, focusing on one debt can feel futile because others feel out of control. And if you ever have feelings like that, you're not alone. Consumer debt is reaching new all-time highs, and while some people think mortgages were only a problem during the recession, 1.4 million homeowners are still underwater. And you've probably heard horror stories of people crushed by the weight of medical bills or are dealing with some of your own. And consumer debts have all sorts of impacts on us. They impact our credit history, which can make it tough or impossible to get new loans. We may deplete our savings trying to stay caught up and be unprepared for those unexpected bills. Falling behind may mean that we have liens placed on our belongings or our wages are garnished. And that's a big reason why 57% of Americans go into retirement with less than $10,000. And all of that takes its toll on us, like sleepless nights or constant worry about day-to-day expenses, and enormous stress that can affect our work or our health. So today, we're going to cover the following items. I'm going to explain the difference between delinquency and default so we know exactly where we stand and what to do next. We'll dive into specific debts like credit cards, personal loans, and medical bills, and share some ideas on how to get current or how to make them more affordable so that we can get ahead. We'll cover loans that are backed by our belongings like car loans and mortgages so that we can prioritize which debts are most important to pay. For our time today, we're not going to be spending a lot of time explaining what each of these debts are. I'm going to assume that if you're focused on any of these, you understand some of the basics of how they work. What we're going to be focused on more are the tactics that help us get out from each of these debts. Lastly, I'll explain what to do if you're dealing with collectors or collection calls. And then, at the end of this module, you'll have a checklist to start tackling each of these debts today. First, I want to just cover some basics on loans and when they're considered late. Loans, or debts, are considered current, delinquent, or in default, depending on how far behind the payments are. I'll explain what each means and what the consequences of each are. First, current means that we're making our payments on time. We still have payments left, but generally our lender is happy because we're meeting the terms of our debt. We could call this being on time. Now, there aren't any pressing issues, particularly from our lender, but it doesn't tell us if we're having trouble with the payment or if we're making sacrifices somewhere else. Now, if we start falling behind on payments, we'll first fall into a category called delinquent. It means that we're not behind by more than 9 months and our lenders still consider us responsible and expect payment. But we're in a category of being delayed on our payments. The consequences here are that we're probably getting charged late fees, and those late payments might be reported to credit bureaus. You'll also probably be receiving some past due notices, or phone calls, letters, or emails from your lender during this time period. If we're far behind, typically over 9 months late, it's called default. This is when the lender might consider us unable to pay the loan. They might sell the debt to a debt collector to recover some of their money. To them, they might consider the agreement canceled, but that doesn't mean you don't have to pay it. In fact, you might lose assets if it's something like a car loan or a mortgage. There are probably fees and penalties, and you may be getting aggressive calls from collectors. They could also sue you and get a judgment that would allow them to garnish wages. On top of that, defaults have a severe impact on your credit history, potentially hurting your chances for getting approved for a new loan, or even things like being approved to rent an apartment. I wanted to cover these stages because it's important to understand how we'll be covering each of these topics today. One goal for this module is to help improve the condition of our debts. It doesn't matter what the state of our debts is now, we want to get them improved. We want to get them closer and closer to current. That means you won't be worried about late debts or being contacted by collectors. We'll be primarily focused today on debts that are delinquent. These are probably urgent to address because we can prevent them from going to default. By being proactive, we can help stabilize them and find ways to make them more affordable. Instead of playing catch-up, we want to get these back to current. We won't be covering a lot of debt in default today, even though these are very important to address. Because they're in default, they're probably already further behind than other debts and will require special consideration. We'll address debts in default specifically in Module 5 with one exception, debt collectors. Collectors may be contacting you on any type of late debts, and I'll share with you some info on how to start dealing with them immediately. By getting out of debt or moving debts from delinquent status to current, you'll have more and more options. Things like using a new loan to consolidate debts or requesting assistance from your lender. And that will allow us to apply more advanced strategies to pay them off even sooner that we'll cover in later sessions. But today is a key step towards getting rid of these debts for good. First, let's address the elephant in the room, credit cards. Credit cards are everywhere. They make life easy by making things available with a simple swipe. Sellers love them because it makes it easier to sell products. Credit card companies love them because, charging an average rate of 14%, they make them a lot of money. Credit cards are revolving, unsecured debt. Revolving debt means that you can make a purchase or borrow against it. You can send in a payment and pay it off. Then you can buy some more with it, and you can send in the same amount. And maybe you don't pay it all off. Then you can buy some more. Even when you're making payments, it's easy to see why credit card balances can grow and why the typical household has thousands of dollars outstanding on credit cards. Now combine that with the temptation of the minimum payment, and it can be tough to make any progress. For example, let's say you have a $5,000 balance on a credit card that charges 12% annually, and you send in a $100 payment. That $100 gets applied to your balance, but a new $50 in interest is added back on. For that $100 that you sent in, it only reduced your balance by $50. Keep paying just the minimum payments, and it would take over 17 years to pay off this credit card. And that's assuming you never charged anything else on it. Minimum payments aren't a recommended payment or a reward for being a good customer. They help maximize the profit for credit card companies by allowing them to charge interest over the longest time possible. Paying more than the minimum helps keep more money in your pocket. So, here's how we can start making those credit card payments more affordable. First, you can request an interest rate reduction. If you've never requested one before, the odds of getting some relief are in your favor. We have more tips on requesting it in the worksheet at the end of the module, but here are a few now. First, shop around and see what other offers are out there. Next, call your oldest credit card company first. Your long history using that company will help. And lastly, you can use a script that helps you lay out why you need a rate reduction and how it'll help you pay them. Second, consider changing your due date. A lot of times we have bills due at the same time of the month. If it would help to have some of your monthly bills come later, maybe after your second paycheck, call your credit card company or request a change to the due date. If you have multiple cards or have received a new card offer, you might be able to use a lower introductory interest rate. You'll have to transfer the balance from your other card, but it might help you pay off more principal more quickly. Keep a couple of things in mind here. One, there will probably be transfer fees, and if you don't pay off the balance by the end of the introductory period, you may actually end up with a higher interest rate than your previous card. Lastly, you might want to refinance or consolidate your cards if you can. Depending on your credit history and capacity, you might be able to get a new loan to pay off the multiple cards. This could help you get a fixed monthly payment that might be easier to manage. We'll cover more of the pros and cons of this shortly. If you're behind on your credit card payments, contact them to see if you can get on a payment plan, also sometimes called a hardship plan. These plans are often combined with a reduced interest rate, which is even better. Keep in mind that most companies will suspend or close your account while you're on this plan, so you won't be able to make any further charges to the card during this period. You could also refinance or consolidate, as I mentioned earlier. And depending on how late payments are, you might need to think about whether you should pay it off at all. I'll cover the things to consider in Module 5. At that time, we'll also look at options like debt management, and if there's no reasonable path to ever paying it off, I'll explain what debt settlement and bankruptcy are. Now, to avoid problems in the future, we want to try to pay each month on time and pay more than the minimum when we can. Ultimately, we want to strive to pay off the balance and have a clean slate each month. Getting there is easier said than done, and here are some tips that might help if you're struggling with credit cards. Cutting them up might prevent you from using them without closing the account so you can use them in case of emergencies. But if you don't even want to have the temptation, it might be best to cancel them altogether. Next, let's talk about personal loans, also referred to as signature loans, because they say they only take your signature to get them. In reality, they are based entirely on your creditworthiness, which will determine if you can get one and what the interest rate will be. I do want to explain personal loans in a bit more detail than the other types of loans because a personal loan might end up being part of the solution for you. Personal loans are unsecured debt like credit cards, but are installment loans, which means they have a set interest rate and regular fixed monthly payments. They are also for a fixed amount of time, usually 1 to 5 years. Personal loans also usually allow for higher debt-to-income ratios, such as 50%, because they are commonly used to consolidate other loans like credit cards, and so lenders expect that other debts will be paid off after you take one. They usually have origination fees, which can be paid out of pocket or added to the loan itself, and they are usually reported to credit bureaus and are often aggressively pursued when late. As I mentioned, a personal loan could be a solution for you. If you're juggling one or more credit cards or other debts and paying their high interest rates, using a personal loan to pay them off and getting a fixed monthly payment might be more manageable. However, there's a risk. After consolidating your credit cards into a personal loan, it can be tempting to use that card again or make a few purchases. If there haven't been any changes to your spending, you might find that some small balances are starting to creep up on credit cards again. Eventually, you might find yourself in the same place with unmanageable credit card and personal loan debt. Not only could the monthly costs be too much to handle, but you might not have any options left to consolidate at that point. If you do have a personal loan, here are some tips to help you manage it. Make payments as frequently as you can. In fact, most personal loans will give you various options when you're making a payment, whether to consider it an early scheduled payment or apply it as an additional payment. If you choose to have it counted as your regularly scheduled payment, you'll actually be ahead. So if something were to happen one month and you weren't able to pay, it wouldn't be considered late. This can be a good strategy if you get paid every other week and have an extra paycheck in some months. You can also shop around for a new loan, maybe find a better interest rate, and pay off an existing personal loan or consolidate multiple loans. This can also help if you need to get your monthly payment down by extending the loan out further. If you're finding it difficult to be able to afford the monthly payments and can't refinance, contact your lender and explore a modification. They may be able to change the terms of the loans, such as reducing the payment by extending the loan out. Keep in mind, they want you to be able to pay it too. And again, debt management, settlement, and bankruptcy might be appropriate for you. Next, let's talk about medical debt. There are lots of different ways that we might end up with medical debts, but in this example, I'm going to cover bills that are owed to a medical provider. Let's say you go to a medical provider, like a hospital. Typically, the bill is sent to your insurance company. They pay the portion that they're responsible for, and then the balance is paid by you. This balance can be pretty high, especially if you're not insured. But even if you are insured or underinsured or have a high out-of-pocket maximum, this could be unaffordable. So to start tackling this, first, we want to make sure that what we owe is correct. Start by making sure that you understand the charges on any bills that you receive. Then, go back to your insurance provider and make sure that your coverages are correct and that they paid for everything that they were supposed to. Once you're sure the charges are accurate, it's time to contact the medical provider that you owe. The good news is that medical debts are often very negotiable. Typically, they'll discount your portion if you're able to pay off the balance right away. While your results might vary, I was recently offered a large discount if I paid off the balance within a month. If you can't afford to pay it off in one shot, request a payment plan. Most facilities are eager to accept regular payments and will often work with you to find a payment that's reasonable. The truth is that medical providers, like a lot of lenders, would prefer to collect something rather than nothing. On top of that, Many medical facilities don't bother reporting to credit bureaus if you're making an effort to pay your bill. And even if they do, some credit score calculations don't weigh medical debts as heavily as other consumer debts. Another tip is, before you get treatment, you can also negotiate what your portion will be. Some providers are willing to heavily discount your portion if insurance is going to cover a large piece of the procedure. Getting that in writing before you decide to proceed can save you a lot of time and hassle. As Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and the best strategy with medical expenses is to avoid them in the first place. Try your best to get appropriate coverage for your needs. Even though insurance premiums might be expensive, they might be a lot cheaper than having unexpected medical bills. Also, if you have access to health-specific savings accounts, like a health or a flexible savings account, they can also help you weather unexpected medical bills. And if you don't have those, you can always use a traditional savings account to help cover costs. And lastly, a tip. If you do end up having a lot of medical expenses within one calendar year, they might be tax deductible if they exceed a certain percentage of your income. Now, I'd like to pause here for a moment because all of the debts that we've discussed so far, credit cards, personal loans, and medical debts, are what we call unsecured, which means the only thing backing them up is your promise to pay them. They aren't secured, or what we call collateralized, by other accounts you might have. In fact, collectors are often aggressive on these types of debts because that's about all they can do to collect. Yes, they can sue you and even garnish your wages, but beyond that, they don't have a lot of options. Now, I bring this up because it's very common for people to try and refinance or consolidate these types of loans into other loans. Probably the most popular option is to use the equity in the home, such as a home equity loan or line of credit. This can be tempting because the interest rate might be lower and it might stop collection calls. However, the big risk is that if you fall behind on a home equity debt, you could possibly lose the home, such as in foreclosure. That's because a home equity loan is a secured debt, backed up by your home. In essence, those unsecured debts might now be putting other things at risk. Some other popular options are to take a loan from a retirement plan or borrow from a cash value life insurance policy. Again, these might be the right solution for you, but if these loans fall behind, you might lose the money outright or have the policy canceled. A better option might be to look into management, settlement, and even bankruptcy, as these choices can keep your home and retirement accounts protected. Now, I mentioned that your mortgage is a secured debt, but it's not the only one. Auto loans are the other popular secured debt. When you get a mortgage, it's backed up by your home. When you get a car loan, it's backed up by your vehicle. That means if you get behind on these types of loans, the lender can take ownership of your property. These types of loans are less risky for the lender because it's easier to recover amounts owed than unsecured loans like credit cards. That lower risk also means that we get lower interest rates than we do on unsecured loans. So let's discuss these types of debts in more detail. First, auto loans. This is the most common type of secured debt, and because there are so many cars on the road, they can create just as many problems. The average new auto loan is about $30,000. The average monthly car payment is $503. Expensive monthly payments mean that over 6 million Americans are 3 months or more behind on their car payments. And it gets worse as cars depreciate rapidly, meaning that loan balances can often be higher than what the car is worth, making it difficult for owners to find options when they can't afford their car anymore. And you might have a false sense of security if your lender isn't calling you when you're late on payments, because they are often just planning on repossessing your vehicle. So if you're struggling with your auto loan, one of your best options might be to request a modification from your lender. A common modification is to stretch out the balance of the loan. Let's say your monthly payment is $300, scheduled to last for 2 more years. They may be willing to stretch it out to get the monthly payment down to $150 a month, but extend the loan out to 4 years. Another modification might be a hardship deferment. If you're suffering from a temporary financial setback, such as a job loss or a temporary financial burden, your lender might allow you to skip several of the scheduled payments. Keep in mind that you'll probably have to prove that you're having a qualifying hardship. Don't be surprised if they require notarized letters, copies of your recent pay stubs, bills showing the unexpected expenses, or other evidence that might be relevant. Now, some tactics for car loans. Some things to consider. Do you even need a car? Is public transit an option? Do you need to buy a car? What about leasing one or buying a really cheap car? 2, if your car is worth enough, you might be able to refinance it into a new loan. Or you might be able to get a loan modification from your lender, as we discussed. If your car is worth more than the balance of the loan, you might be able to trade it in or sell it, or replace it with a cheaper alternative. You can also turn in your keys in what's called a voluntary repossession, or you can let them repossess it directly. This may be an option for just washing your hands of it right away. Keep in mind, you might be responsible for any deficiency that remains on the loan. And bankruptcy is an option too. You might even be able to get a new payment plan and keep your car. To avoid some of these problems, here's a quick rule of thumb, the 10% rule. To keep your car affordable, all of your monthly car expenses should be less than 10% of your monthly income. If it's more than this, it's a good idea to consider other options. And finally, we're at mortgages, the biggest debt that most people will ever have. Again, it's a secured loan, backed up by the home itself. They can have a fixed or variable interest rate, and you can get them in a variety of lengths. It should be no surprise then that the biggest debts also have the biggest payments. In fact, the median monthly payment is $1,030. Add in property taxes, insurance, private mortgage insurance, PMI, any homeowners association's dues, the utilities and maintenance costs, and it's no wonder suddenly payments can become late. When a payment is late after 15 days, it can result in a late fee. Usually about 2 to 5% of the regular monthly payment is tacked on. By the second missed payment, the mortgage can be considered in default. The lender will probably reach out to you and you'll receive late notices. It can be a good idea to reach out to a housing counselor at this point to avoid getting further behind. By the third missed payment, you'll usually receive a demand letter stating that you have 30 days to bring the mortgage current. This is also when your lender will initiate the foreclosure process and begin legal action. There's even more difficulty when you factor in home values. Since home values tended to go up, when you started to find that a home was unaffordable, you'd just sell it and right-size. However, the last decade has left a lot of people without that option. Let's look at my house as a real example. When home prices were rising, I took the plunge and purchased my home in 2006. I think we all have an idea of what the real estate market did after that. My home values plunged, and 12 years later, it's still worth less than when I bought it. What's even more striking is that when we compare it to my mortgage balance, it's still underwater, meaning I owe more on my home than it's worth, which means that I can't sell it. A lot of people find themselves in this situation, not able to sell it, and just left with no choice but to try to keep up with their payments. Unfortunately, this is the spot that 1.4 million homeowners are still in today. This means that modifying an existing mortgage is often the best option for a lot of homeowners. While there are a lot of different types of modifications, here are 2 popular ones. Reducing the interest rate. Right now, you have a monthly payment based on a particular interest rate. Some lenders will adjust the interest rate down, making the payment shrink as well. This might make the monthly payment more affordable, but keep in mind that this type of modification alone might not dramatically change the payment. But if you're close to being able to afford the payment, this might be enough. The second modification is to address missed payments. Maybe you can afford the payments now but had a temporary setback and are behind. This modification will take the missed payments and add them onto the end of the loan. It will extend out the loan somewhat, but you'll also be considered current. Of course, you'll have to be comfortable with the monthly payment amount, otherwise it might cause problems later. There are some additional options to consider too. Maybe you can move or downsize. Maybe you can rent out part of your home or take on a roommate. Don't be afraid to come up with creative options that fit you. Another option is reverse mortgage. For homeowners that are over age 62, you might be able to stop making mortgage payments or even get some cash out. And as we discussed, working with your existing lender might be the most realistic path to getting help. From refinancing to modifying, or possibly even forbearance, which is a temporary reprieve from making payments, might be available to you. Every lender has different programs, so you'll want to contact them to explain what your needs are and see what they can put together for you. If you're further behind, in default, or even facing foreclosure, check out HUD.gov for additional resources. They have a great guide with resources to get you started. You may also want to seek out a housing counselor if you're dealing with this on your own. Also, check your state and local governments for housing assistance programs. In my area, the county has a program to help homeowners in trouble. And again, reach out to your lender. You may be able to short sell your property if you're underwater without owing the difference. Your lender probably doesn't want to foreclose, but if they do, you actually might be owed money if you had substantial equity. And lastly, bankruptcy could be an option that might get you a modified payment that you can afford. And here's a rule of thumb that might help you avoid mortgage problems, the 28% rule. Ideally, your monthly home expenses, including mortgage payment, taxes, and insurance, should be less than 28% of your monthly income. And a quick tip, you don't need to pay private mortgage insurance, PMI, once your mortgage balance is less than 78% of your appraised value. So, if you've been paying off your loan faster than you expected, or if you think your home is appreciated significantly in value, you can contact your mortgage company about getting that removed. So we've now covered the main consumer debts, and hopefully you've gotten some ideas to pursue. But I promised you that I'd discuss debt collectors too, because you may be dealing with some right now. First, let me explain briefly how debt collectors work. When you owe money, say to a credit card company, and you get behind or stop paying, the credit card company will try to collect from you. But after a while, usually once it's in default, the credit card company will consider it uncollectible and try to get some of their money back. They'll do this by selling your debt, usually to a debt collector. Debt collectors will buy your debt along with hundreds or thousands of other debts for sometimes pennies on the dollar. The credit card company will consider the issue closed, and now you'll technically owe the debt to the debt collector directly. In some ways, this is good because it gives you some really distinct options. And since collectors may be contacting you now, I want to explain what collectors cannot do. The FTC enforces the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which spells out ground rules for collectors. First, they can't come to your workplace, even though they might say they will. Second, they can't threaten or harass you, meaning threaten you physically. They also can't arrest you, despite what they might say. And they also can't call you at night between 9 p.m. and 8 a.m. If you're being contacted and have experienced firsthand behavior that's not allowed, complain to a government agency and report it. You can even sue them if they are engaging in illegal activities. Next, you'll want to know exactly what debts they are trying to collect. If you find that the debts are wrong or were settled earlier, make sure you dispute them. And to stop calls, you can also write a cease and desist letter, which they are supposed to honor. You can get sample letters for the different types of debt collectors from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Of course, I need to cover what collectors can do. First, they can call you. In fact, they can call people who might know how to get in touch with you if they can't find you, although they can't share any of the reasons why with them. They can report to credit bureaus. They can also take legal action, such as suing you or pursuing a judgment to collect. They can also sell your debt to another agency or collector, which is why verifying who currently owns your debt on your credit report can help you save you time and frustration. And lastly, but probably most importantly, they can negotiate. Remember when I mentioned that the debt collector may have bought the debt for pennies on the dollar? The good news is that they may be willing to accept significantly less than the amount actually owed. So let's cover how you might be able to negotiate a deal that's good for you. So in order to stop the calls and start the negotiation, you'll first want to engage with the collector over the phone. You'll also want to know what the statute of limitations are for suing you for the debt in your state. In some states, it's 4 years, but it may be longer. That means that if the time limit is passed, the collector may not be able to sue you, making it more likely they'll accept a deal. Also, you'll want to know exactly what the debt is. Don't just accept their numbers as correct. There may be interest and fees added on to an original amount. Know what you can afford and are able to pay. You don't want to offer an amount that you won't be able to come up with. And stand your ground. In many situations, you'll have the advantage because the collector has very little actual power to make you pay. And don't be afraid to remind them of alternatives, such as refusing to pay or declaring bankruptcy if it's realistic. And lastly, get everything in writing. If you've agreed to a deal, ask for them to remove the debt or mark it as paid on your credit report. Make sure you get it in writing so you can enforce it if they don't live up to their end of the deal. Here are a couple of tips. Document every conversation you have, the details of the offers, the time and dates of every call, and keep copies of any correspondence like letters or email. And when contacted by a collector, don't confirm responsibility for a debt. Just gather the necessary information about the debt they're calling about and look into it. Admitting responsibility can make it harder to negotiate later. So we covered a lot of ground today, but I wanted to reiterate two key things from this module: which debts we should pay first and how we can start chipping away at these consumer debts right now. Now, in an ideal world, we'd be able to make all of our payments. But if we end up in a situation where we might not be able to pay all of them and have to prioritize which ones we should pay, we want to take care of our secured first, then the hard to discharge ones, and then lastly, unsecured debts. We talked about the differences between secured debts, like auto loans and mortgages, and unsecured debts, like credit cards and personal loans. Because secured loans are backed up with our property, we want to make them a priority so we don't lose our home or car. There are other obligations which we'll cover later, which are hard or impossible to get rid of without paying them off, like student loans or even back taxes. We'll want to focus on those next. However, the main point is that unsecured debts, even though they can absolutely affect us and our credit history, are much more limited in their impact on us, as well as how lenders can collect from us. And we want to be really careful about refinancing or consolidating those unsecured debts into secured debts that might put us at greater risk. And the most important takeaway: how to start chipping away at consumer debt today. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I want to provide you with some simple checklists to make debts more affordable and get the ones that are behind caught up. So here's some basic checklists that you can use for each type of debt, like credit cards, getting a lower interest rate or a change of due date, using an introductory interest rate when appropriate, or consolidating, or working with your credit card to get a payment arrangement, personal loans or signature loans, how we can avoid falling behind by making our scheduled payments as soon as we're able. Again, refinancing or consolidating or modifying might be an option, and later we'll talk about debt management. Medical debts. We're going to double check the charges and offer a payment for a discount or request an affordable payment plan. Auto loans. Refinance or modify. Do we even need a car? Can we trade it in, sell it, or just turn it in? And mortgages. Can we rethink our housing situation? What do we really need? Is a reverse mortgage appropriate? Should we work with our lender for a modification, forbearance, or refinancing? And if we have more pressing issues, contacting HUD or local programs to help us out. And lastly, debt collectors. Engage, but don't accept responsibility yet. Put yourself in a position to negotiate. This probably feels like a lot of information, and it is. But I wanted to share with you some ideas right away because working through each of these options might take just a phone call, while others might take a few weeks. I wanted to make sure that you'd be able to start right away. That's because in later modules, we'll discuss more creative strategies, some specific rules, special programs, and formal services that can help us make some leaps ahead. And the more debts you have in a stable or current state, the more options you'll have and be able to use. So that brings us to this week's activity. In the last module, you completed your debt inventory, gathering all of your debts together. In fact, you should have checked the past due box for debts that require immediate attention. This week, we have a checklist of options for tackling each type of debt. So we're going to use that with your first worksheet to come up with the next steps for each of the consumer debts that you have listed. For example, if you have a credit card listed in the first line, look at that credit card checklist and decide, do you want to request an interest rate reduction? Or do you want to explore consolidating it into a personal loan? Maybe you're behind and would like to pursue a payment plan. Use the Chipping Away Consumer Debt worksheet to pick a tactic that makes sense for you for each of the consumer debts. And let's get started. As I mentioned, today was about focusing on our urgent needs. It's about getting us into the best possible place in the shortest amount of time. Today, I wanted to triage our most immediate issues to set us up for success in the next modules. I'm looking forward to continuing the journey with you as we break free for good.